One thing I learned very early on in my career was never to speak right before lunch or right before a cocktail reception. I know everybody's hungry, and I'm going to be brief so that we can all get off to lunch. Do I hit it here? Or? Okay. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to come down and speak. It was very interesting for me to listen yesterday to the presentations, because many of the issues that you are dealing with and questioning are issues that we're dealing with in the United States, and we've been wrestling with for the last 80, 90 years. So what I thought that we'd do today is that we'd start by providing an overview of U.S. anti-abuse rules and common law doctrines. Unlike Brazil, the United States is a common law jurisdiction. As Eleanor mentioned, we borrowed from the British. It is normal in our system. It is natural in our system that judges make law. As Eleanor was talking about in the Canadian system, that her GAR rules shouldn't serve as a backstop to legislation. They shouldn't fill in the gaps. Well, in the U.S. system, judges fill in the gaps all the time. In fact, that's a fairly frequent occurrence, is that judges will fill in the gaps until the legislature catches up. So when we get a series of cases that are decided in a similar way, we tend to refer to those cases as a doctrine. And so it's very important that we talk about some of those doctrines today. Then we're going to turn and talk about Section 77010. This was just enacted this year. And the importance of this provision is that it is the first time ever in the over 100 years that we've had an Income Tax Act when the U.S. Congress has sought to codify or put into our code a common law doctrine. What's important to recognize is they only codified one of our doctrines. All of the other doctrines are still in force. So we now have to deal with this code provision, and we still have to deal with all of our common law doctrines. Lastly, we're going to talk about certain ways that perhaps the U.S. experience and the questions that we have raised in our system may influence you when you are crafting your regulations in Brazil. I heard yesterday that there was a desire that the Brazilian rules enhance transparency and enhance certainty in your system. Well, in the U.S., we've asked a lot of questions about our anti-abuse rule. We don't have a lot of answers, but at least we know what the questions are. So we will go through some of those questions that we've raised in our system, and hopefully you guys will be able to come up with some answers for your regulation. Let's start with an overview of our U.S. anti-abuse rules. When you talk about U.S. anti-abuse rules, you've always got to ask which rule. We have lots and lots of anti-abuse rules. We have anti-abuse rules in our treaties. We have anti-abuse rules in our Internal Revenue Code, and I'm only listing a few here just as examples. We have anti-abuse rules in our regulations. Almost every major regulation we have has its own anti-abuse rule. We have other administrative guidance, rulings and notices that seek to shut down certain transactions. The key point to keep in mind is that all of the foregoing tend to be very problem specific. They are not general rules. Until very recently, this year, there was no general overarching general anti-avoidance rule like they have in Canada. Instead, we have these common law doctrines. And these common law doctrines have essentially served as our general anti-avoidance rule. The most important doctrine that we have is called the substance over form doctrine. And this is a big difference between the United States and Canada. You heard Eleanor talk earlier about the fact that the Canadian judges did not really buy into or accept the substance over form doctrine. They basically tax transactions in accordance with their form. That is not the case in the United States. It is well accepted in the United States by courts, by the government, and by taxpayers that we tax transactions in accordance with their substance. Let me give you an example. You may loan money to a subsidiary. You advance money to a subsidiary. You put at the top of the document, you call it a loan. That's the name on the document. We don't care in the United States what you happen to call that particular document. We are going to look at the economic rights that are created in that document, and we're going to ask, are those rights more like equity, or are they more like debt? That is a simple example of where we look beyond form and we look to the underlying substance. Now, it's important to distinguish the substance over form doctrine from anti-abuse doctrines. The substance over form doctrine should not be viewed as an anti-abuse doctrine. Why? Why do I say that? I say that for two reasons. First of all, both taxpayers and the government can assert the substance over form doctrine. And I will show you a statistic at the end of the presentation which provides evidence of that fact. Second, application of the doctrine does not always lead to more tax. A taxpayer can assert the substance over form doctrine and actually pay less tax. That's why it's important when you look at U.S. law not to think of the substance over form doctrine as an anti-abuse doctrine. It's really not. Our main anti-abuse doctrine is, and the first anti-abuse doctrine, was the business purpose doctrine. And I have to apologize to Marco because this didn't start with the Romans in our country, but it does date back to 1935, which is pretty old for us, okay? And it starts in this case called Gregory v. Helvering, which is a case that the Canadian courts have looked to as well. And the court in Gregory v. Helvering stated that in order to be respected, a transaction must have business purpose. Business purpose. That's easy to say. It's not so easy to understand what that means. Ever since 1935, people have been arguing about what exactly business purpose means. There are cases, and I would say the majority of cases, which would state that in order to have a business purpose, you must have a specific non-tax motivation for the transaction. You have to have that. If you do not have that, you do not have business purpose. If you do not have business purpose, we won't respect your transaction. That is the predominant view. There are other cases I could point you to, however, that where the court said, look, all the court in Gregory v. Helvering was trying to say is that you have to look at the context